JFK, it's time you know the truth. I was thinking about it and I thought before I release Satan's final plan, you need to be aware of exactly how far back this little season really goes. So brace yourself because you are in for quite an awakening. And honestly, I am only going to share two events, but it goes way back to the very beginning of time. These are not my findings, but that of a brilliant man who I am going to give you information on how to access all his writings when I am done with showing you the JFK truce and the Lincoln assassination truce. There are over 260, if not more, things we have been deceived by in our history. Please read the rest of this, for I can't say because of censoring. It is going to be important that you follow along because there's a lot of words I'm not going to be allowed to say because of our fun friends, the censor people. So here we go. In a decade, a few people have woken from their slumber, cued by the lies surrounding that event, and that event. They have learned to see through the bedtime stories they have been told. With this suspicion of disbelief destroyed, they are now ready to reconsider the other stories of recent history. In this paper, we will look at the Kennedy fairy tale. We will start by studying of him, but by the end we will see that all the stories about all the Kennedys are of a piece, nothing you think you know, all the way back to 1944. It's true. It has long been clear to almost all intelligent people who study the evidence that the Warren Commission was a cover-up. Something like 80% of those polled admit they don't believe the Warren Commission report, and we must assume that the other 20% are very gullible. Some have also studied the so-called conspiracy theories, the alternate theories, that is, but it should be equally clear that the alternate theories are, in most ways, just as full of holes and just as poorly constructed as the standard theories. Like the Warren Commission report, the alternative theories also read like a propaganda. The style of all the counter stories, in whatever form, has been just as fishy as the Warren Commission story. To those of us trained to look at form as well as content, the countered stories also read like a script or like a transparent effort at mind control. Let me suggest to you that both set of stories were created mainly as misdirections and disinformation. This is not to say that all alternative theorists are controlled by the government or by anyone else. It is only to suggest that alternative theories in all forms but one seem to be encouraged by the government and the powers that be. We have also always assumed that alternative theories would be frowned upon or discouraged, and yet we have never seen much real effort at suppression. In fact, in most cases, the dissemination of alternate theories would seem to be abate by the mainstream, not suppressed. You should ask yourself, if the alternate theories and theorists might be selling the main line of the desired story just as fully as the standard theory. For the powers that be, it may not matter whether you believe there was one shooter or many, or even whether you believe that the CIA or FBI was involved. The only thing that is critical is that you believe Kennedy was assassinated that day, and the alternative theories sell that fact with even more emphasis and gusto than the Warren Commission one. As it turns out, the alternative theories make a much greater hero out of Kennedy than the standard theories, and it may be that this is a welcome side effect to the real conspiracy. The first determination of those controlling both sides is that you, the public, be kept monumentally confused, so that you can never ask the proper questions. This end is achieved by having many competing theories. In this way, the Warren Commission was only the official fake story. What is all being said here basically is they control all of it. They control the story they feed you. They control all the conspiracy theories after that. The only thing they care about is that you never, ever learn the truth. And that is why we can never figure this one out, but today we will. Same with the same thing that happened in the year 2001. You go down that road. I went down it for 15 years, and I wrote a 500-page book about it, but of course, that would have been censored like crazy. Anyways, the point is, that was like putting a puzzle together, and right when you think you were going down the right path, you find out it's all lies. And they do this on purpose so that we can never get to the truth. That is what this is all saying here. But the other fake stories are just as important in the long-running effort to make it seem that there is no right answer. The storytellers are quite satisfied to have an ever-growing mass of speculation and opinion, which almost inevitably must overwhelm all investigators. The more division that are created, the less likely it is that anyone will discover the real clues, because everybody will always be fighting over one stupid thing, like was it on the grassy knolls, was it not, things like that. As an example of how alternative theories have been disseminated by the government itself, I send you to a recent paper of his on Ramparts magazine. Ramparts was one of the first to publish alternative theories of the assassination, beginning in the late 1960s. Although Ramparts was considered to be a far left or even Anarchist rag at that time, it turns out it was another CIA front, like Encounter, Partisans Review, Paris Review, and most other intellectual magazines. By the 1960s, the CIA had infiltrated the entire media, including smaller, seemingly independent journals like Ramparts. The CIA was even good enough to admit this during the Senate Church Committee hearing in the 1970s. And you can read about it in other papers on the Cultural Cold War. You may also consult the book of Francis Stoner Saunders. In this paper, I will tell you what really happened that day and what has really happened since 1944. The JFK mystery is just one part of a much larger mystery, a mystery I will unravel for you in the second half of this paper. The JFK assassination is the key that unlocks more than a half a century of closed doors, allowing us to see behind the greatest curtain of all. The problem from the beginning is that you have been given theories before you looked at the facts yourself. I will turn that on its head, giving you the facts before I tell you the whole story. You will have already built your own theory, most likely, before I even begin collaborating. The facts alone will take you there. I will present to you the most critical facts and clues and other evidence without at first looking at them as part of one theory or another. As Sherlock Holmes told us, it is dangerous to have a theory before you have the facts. And up to now, we have had two possible theories. Either Kennedy was killed by Oswald or he was killed by someone else. I will show you that the facts taken alone point to neither of these two conclusions. Those who have done any investigation at all, the many arguments against the standard theory, but let us now look critically at the alternative theory. Not as apologists for the standard theory, but simply as a rational people. The alternative theory tells us that everything we have been told is a lie. We can accept that, I think. Then they begin building an argument by stating that Kennedy had many enemies. The main difference between different theories concerns which enemies actually got him. We are told that these enemies included Johnson, the CIA, the FBI, Hoover, the Secret Service, Texas oilmen, Castro, the Russians, the bankers, and the mobs. That is a very powerful, a lot of powerful enemies. Every alternative theory without exception, except that Kennedy had made a lot of very powerful enemies. Some theories may downplay some of the players above and play up others, but all the theories begin with the idea that Kennedy was surrounded by enemies. Now, I don't need to argue against that list or any part of it. I could try to pick it apart by showing that although Kennedy had many enemies in the CIA, for instance, he had control of another part of it. And that this part was also powerful, completely capable of gathering information. I could show that his brother, the Attorney General, was very powerful and had some very powerful friends in the DOJ and elsewhere. I could remind you that Joseph Kennedy, his father, had mob connections, to say the least, and that John also had direct connections. I could remind you of Frank Sinatra and Sam Guinicon, for instance, who are known to have helped deliver the 1960s elections and so on, but I don't need to do that. I can accept that Kennedy was surrounded by powerful enemies. I can accept the entire list above. In fact, the bigger and scarier the list, the better I like it, for it leads to my first question to you. Number 1, if Kennedy was surrounded by such a pack of jackal hungries for his blood, why would he go on their turf, ride through it in broad daylight in an open car among uncontrolled tall buildings? Why would it do it without stopping normal traffic in downtown Dallas? There was normal traffic going in the opposite direction on Commerce. You can see the cars in the background on the Zapruder video film. The windows in the car were even rolled all the way down. Although they had bulletproof glass in 1963, and we must assume the car was equipped with it, look closely at photographs of that day and you will see that the windows on the other side is partially up, providing some protection for the ladies on that side. But on JFK's side, the windows are all the way down. Also, according to the Zapruder and other documents and films, people were allowed to line the streets, only a few feet from the motorcade. We can see this in many pictures that more than one person actually stepped off the curb and out into the street, uncontested by police. One lady claims to have stepped within an arm's length of the motorcade, shouting, "Look over here for pictures." We know this is true from other evidence, such as the Daniels film taken of the cars emerging from the far side of the bridge, or the 2 little boys are waving. The car passes only a few feet from the boys and the movie camera. I show further proof of it in other photos from Bell and others. Those alternative theories who point out how odd it is for the Secret Service to have been pulled off the back of the car and for the building windows to be open don't mention that it is even odder for the route to be so completely uncontested. They imply by omission that it was normal in 1963 to have ladies with cameras stepping out in the street and men with movie cameras milling around on the grass and hundreds of day trippers rubbernecking in whatever fashion suited them with absolutely no effort at crowd control. But it wasn't. Compare the visit to Miami or Chicago weeks earlier, and you will see that this protocol wasn't normal at all. Not in 1963 or even 1863. Common sense would tell you that you don't allow strangers that close to the president under any circumstance. It has nothing to do with the 60s being more innocent time or any of that misdirection. Truman would have not been caught in that situation, or Wilson or anyone else, much less a president like Kennedy, supposedly surrounded by a combination of enemies unparalleled in history. People then tried to blame his Secret Service, but Kennedy had eyes, even if it's true that he could not have known about the open window in the book depository until he got there. The other factors were clear to anyone who was awake. He didn't need to be briefed or to rely on intelligent reports from good guys or bad guys. All he needed to do is look around. Whoever was riding in that motorcade could see that the public was lining the streets, that traffic was uncontrolled, that the car had no protection, and so on. Even if they lied to him about the route, he could see with his own eyes that he was a sitting duck. Do you think a man with so many enemies would be smiling and waving to a crowd, supposing he was ever stupid enough to get caught in that position? No. He would be hiding under the seat, ordering the driver to get him out of there as fast as possible. In response to this question, people tell me that Kennedy was naive, that he was an egomaniac, that he was controlled, and so on. But who is naive here? Do these responses even begin to answer my questions in a meaningful way? No. They are just more propaganda put forward to keep us from looking at what really happened without a preset explanation. An egomaniac would be the last person to get caught in that situation. Since he values his own life so much, he would not give his life away just to enjoy a few cheers. We know that Kennedy was not stupid. He was also not naive. In that famous speech that the alternative theorists love to play, Kennedy warns us of the secret government and asks us for our help. Does the same man who gave that speech allow himself to be put into an open car in an uncontrolled major city with a bullseye on his head? Of course not. One of the most influential alternative theory film after Oliver Stone's JFK is a multiple-part documentary first aired on the History Channel called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. Notice that we have a mainstream channel selling the conspiracy theory, and that this is documented, somehow obtained access to a lot of obscure FBI evidence. Also note that the History Channel is a known intelligent front created specially to propaganda its viewers. Again, basically like any other media, all controlled. Nothing new under the sun. I have no intention of criticizing this film point for point, or even as a whole. I only want to point out to you one scene from it. In Miami, the FBI had infiltrated plans for an assassination attempting similar to Dallas, we are told. Plotters were captivated on audio tape, and in the film, the agents themselves even show how they planted the recording devices and in which houses. Then we listen to the tape from October 1963. The key moment is when the bad guy asks the spy, "Do you know how many body doubles the president has here?" Most people don't pause on that, but it made my head turn. The man does not ask if there are body doubles, but how many. Of course, the president travels with body doubles. The alternative theory now pushes that idea with that guy. Since according to many of them, that guy is not dead. In fact, I think it is very likely that that guy is not dead. The film of that guy's death looks so vague. It was fishy in many ways, but few remember that Kennedys would be expected to have body doubles too, just like that guy. If Kennedy did decide that the motorcade should go on simply as a PR move to get votes for the election in 1964, then he would certainly have nominated one of his body doubles to take the ride. Critics of my theory will say that people could tell the difference, but people are not as good as they think at recognizing small differences in the human face. In fact, without verbal cues, clothing cues, and familiar gestures, people are actually terrible at differentiating between people who look similar. Just recent Conan O'Brien proved this on his Late Show by sending a body double that resembled him, only distance out into the street to talk to people. No one recognized that it was not him, although he is 6'4" and the body double was under 6 feet. The double was way off in many other ways. The only similarity between the red hair, really. The voice was almost completely different, and Conan is famous for his talk show. Afterwards, the audience pretended to be astonished that people could be so blind and deaf, but this is quite normal. In my experience, most people are blind to all but the most obvious differences, and the only reason they don't make more mistakes than they do is that they generally relate to small groups of familiar people and do so with the help of voice, gesture, and clothing recognition. But I should state that even more strongly, as we will see, people are not good at seeing any clues, no matter how obvious, much less subtle facial differences. As the premier example, see my analyst of the Bobby Kennedy pictures, in which photos used on the front page of the major newspaper have glaring paste-up problems, and no one has seen them in 40 years. This is all to say that a large majority of people are fabulous, easy to fool regarding body doubles or anything else. Nobody is going to question if the man in the car is Kennedy, since subconsciously they think, who else is it going to be in the car? Almost no one was close enough to make a positive ID, and those that were would not be asking themselves the questions. Others in the motorcade could also be fooled with very little effort. Simply let them see the real Kennedy waiting to get in the car, making the switch at the last moment, in the dark of the parking garage or something, and then drive on. He is front, so all they can see is the back of his head. Anyone who gets a clue can be paid off or coerced. But even coercion would be unnecessary, since those in the motorcade are either friends or enemies. You don't care what your enemies think. You are using the body double to fool them, and your friends are not going to say anything anyways. They will understand the need for the body double, won't they? If they have to lie afterwards, so what? They are politicians. They lie for a living. In what is considered to be one of the most outrageous theories concerning JFK, a researcher named Robert Morningstar has offered the idea that Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit was used as a body double for the president. If you will remember, Tippit was said to have been killed by Oswald as he fled downtown Dallas. Strictly, Morningstar would have Tippit used a coarse double, but the idea is much the same. Tippit was known among the Dallas police as something of a Kennedy look-alike. Additionally, Tippit's head wound was similar to the head wound decided on for Kennedy by the Warren Commission. Both very suggestive, as I think you will agree. However, on closer examination, Morningstar's argument begins to fall apart. A large part of his argument centers on moles, but features larger and easier to see than moles kill his visual proof. The most famous corpse photo is Robert Grodin, leaked photo from Bethesda Morningstar publisher. This photo, right next to a photo of Tippit's corpse, I was able to spot the problem immediately, which is the septum of the nose. That is a division between the nostrils. We are looking up at both heads, and the two septums are prominent. Tippit's nose is extraordinary for its very narrow septum. The Kennedy corpse, whoever it is, has a wide spectrum. It is not Tippit. No, Morningstar's theory is more misdirections. It is possible that it is official disinformation, or it may only be a lucky near hit from an outsider allowed to thrive previously because it is wrong. Either way, it is suggestive and remains so, even after it has been shown to fail. Even if it is purposeful misdirection, it can be turned, since it contains a grain of truth. For although the Kennedy corpse is Bethesda is not Tippit, it is not Kennedy either, as I will show. That said, it is possible that Tippit was used as Kennedy's double in a different part of the story. Tippit may have been used as an extra corpse double in Dallas, but he was not the corpse double in Bethesda, as you will see. As I was studying in the Morningstar images of Kennedy and Tippit as well, and returning to the archives to look at all the famous pictures of Kennedy, there are several very distincting characters jumped out at me. Moles can be covered or penciled in, but other things are not as easy to cover or fake. In the Bethesda death photos, we cannot see everything clearly, but there are some things we can see clearly. We can see the upper teeth, we can see the forehead, we can see the spectrum and the shape of the underside of the nose, and things of that nature. So the logical thing to do is to take what we have rather than trying to compare things we may not have. We know that the wounds have been manipulated, since even if they were not manipulated for sinister purposes, they would have been manipulated for medical ones. The doctors may have intentionally tried to close them to stop loss of blood, for instance, or for any number of other possibility valid reasons. So it is best to look at areas that could not and would not be manipulated. Before we do that, I remind you that the Kennedy was illegally taken out of Texas after a murder without the local coroner being able to do an autopsy. Secret Service ordered Dr. Earl Rose to stand down and took the body to the airport. That is a big clue as any other, telling us they could not risk letting Dr. Rose examine the body. To show you exactly why, let's do so ourselves. The forehead is a good place to start, since a large part of its pristine. We have the wound well above the right eye, near the hairline, and the right eyebrow has been shaved. It is true that Kennedy had a weaker eyebrow on that side, but it was weak on the outside, not the inside. We can see that the inside part of the eyebrow here clearly, and there is nothing there. That is very curious. The normal commentary on this photo is to point out that the wound does not match the huge hole of the Zapruder film, and I agree with that commentary. I am not here to contradict the given commentary in this section, but to add to it. I agree that the wound is fishy, but I think other things are even more fishy. To begin with, why is the eyebrow shaved but not the hairline? Shaving the eyebrow is a pre-op procedure, but there would have been no reason to operate on a wound of this sort. First of all, the man was already dead. Second of all, the first doctors in Dallas were going to operate post-mortem, out of some wild hope for a miracle or to cover their butts, as some of the doctors have claimed. Then they would have shaved both the eyebrows and the hair on top of the head. At the very least, they would have shaved the area around the wound, and yet we don't see that hair much near the wound, then the eyebrow in its place. So why was the eyebrow shaved? I suggest to you that the eyebrow was shaved simply because it didn't look like Kennedy's. Eyebrow arch and thickness is very distinctive, and it would be one of the first things anyone would go to for a likeness. Here are the pictures that we were referring to where his eyebrows were shaved. The eyebrows of this guy didn't match Kennedy, so they shaved it. It is that simple. From the side view, the shape of the eyebrow can't really be determined. All we can see from both photos is that the left eyebrow has now been shaved. We cannot determine much else about it, but an intact right eyebrow in the first photo would be one of the first things we would look to for a likeness. That is why it is gone. It is also worth noting that this frontal photo and to the left profile were leaked, but not the right profile. The right profile is much more important, since that is where the wound is, but instead we get the left profile where nothing can be seen, not even the arch of the intact eyebrow. That is also a clue. Now back to the forehead. As you can see, this forehead is very smooth. It has no wrinkles. Even in the high-ranking light we have here, the light is coming from below, as you can easily tell by the shadow above the upper lip, an even darker shadow above the nose, and the light is very bright since we are looking at an autopsy table, and since the highlights are very white, and yet we see no wrinkles at all on the forehead. This should appear doubly odd since corpses are not famous for taking on water. As everyone knows, corpses dry up. Wrinkles should be expected to increase, not decrease. Yes, corpses do some strange things, and bloating may occur in other parts of the body, but there would be no water retained in the head, especially a head lacking a brain. To continue with that logic, study the eyes. Don't you think it's peculiar they are open? This was many hours after his death, remember. The corpse had been transported a long distance between cities. Apparently, we are supposed to believe the eyes had never been closed, and yet they are still watery. How can that be? Your eyes would dry out if you don't blink every 10 seconds, and you are alive. But we are supposed to believe this corpse has had its eyes open for many hours and that its eyes are somehow miraculously full of liquid? Again, this is supposed to be a corpse with a head with no brain and no blood. Both have been blown out of it by a high-powered rifle, we are told. So there should be nothing in that skull to keep the eyes moist. They should have shriveled up. Not only is that guy not Kennedy, he isn't even dead. Before we move on, compare the first one there to the corpse. Go to the left eyebrow, your right. See how in the picture of the living Kennedy that eyebrow is gone on the outside? This happens to some guys in their 40s. The eyebrows start to shed. We'll compare that to the corpse. Study the left eyebrow in the second photo to the side, including the inset enlargement. There is clearly an intact eyebrow, even to the outside of the eye. The hair is dark and the line continues far past the middle of the eye. No match. But let's continue. Some have claimed that the wax man had already arrived preparing the corpse for the coffin, but this is absurd. Yes, mortician wax is used for the purpose of filling wrinkles, but it is not used on the autopsy table. We are about a day early for that. These photos are supposed to be leaked from the autopsy, not from the embalming and coffin prep. In these photos, we should see Jack's defying brow wrinkles, but we do not. Others will say that the bright light is drowning out the wrinkles, but this is false. Bright light makes wrinkles worse, not better. Do you look younger in bright morning light or in the low evening light? You look younger in low light, and everyone knows this. To make someone who is not young look younger in a photo, you shoot in low light and make sure it is not ranking. Here we have ranking lights that is very bright. The wrinkles should be worse. I guarantee you that if you look worse in the morning, you will look even worse when you are dead. Getting shot in the head will not make you look younger, and I don't recommend it as a beauty treatment. And yet this corpse looks years younger than Kennedy. Remember that Kennedy, although famous as being the youngest president, was 46 in 1963. In the middle photograph above, he is 42, but he already has deep brow wrinkles. The first photo was taken in 1963, and you can see that he has gained weight. He looks all of 46, slightly bloated, thinning and drying lips, and spots begin to appear on his face. Take note especially of the prominent spot on his left cheek and the smaller one on his upper right lip. We can see the spot on his lip in all three photos. It is probably a mole, and yet we don't see them at all in the Bashida photos. The same is true of the crow's feet and all other signs of age on the face. We see some very faint lines at the edge of the eyes in the Bushido photos, but these look more like the ridges of a man in his early 30s, not his late 40s. Again, the photos do not match Kennedy. While we are studying these 3 photos, we can sharpen our eyes by practicing on other details. We can see that Jack got a nose job and an ear tuck sometime between the second and third photos. The bridge of his nose is much thinner and sharper in the older photos, and the ear tuck is clear to anyone who looks closely. But let us move on. Another thing to look at is the folds under the eye. We cannot see the folds over the eye in the corpse photo, which are highly distinctive, especially with Kennedy, but we work with what we have. When Morningstar was comparing Kennedy and Tippett, one of the first things I noticed was that Kennedy had much larger folds under the eye. Tippett has no underfolds at all. He is smooth and has only the beginning of circles. But Kennedy has very pronounced folds, folds that he had since he was younger. The corpse has pronounced shadows from the cheekbones, but no folds under the eyes at all. With this ranking light, the folds should have been incinerated, but instead they are gone. There is no medical way to account for this except by remembering this isn't Kennedy. The next thing to look at is the teeth. We can see Tippett's teeth clearly in this death photo, and these corpse teeth are not those of Tippett. Just as a starter, Tippett is missing his first bicust on the right side, and the Bushido corpse is not. All the visible teeth are different too. But what of Kennedy's? As you can see from this photo, all of Kennedy's incisors' forefront teeth are wide, while his cuspid canines are fairly sharp. The Bushido corpse has smaller incisors than Kennedy and cuspids that are almost like incisors flat. In fact, all 8 front teeth appear to be about the same size in the Bushido photo, which is extremely rare. The Bushido corpse would appear to have perfect dentures or costume teeth rather than real teeth. Had Kennedy gotten dentures or caps since this early picture of him? No. Here he is as president smiling. You can clearly see that the pointed cuspids, another thing, pushes us in the direction of false teeth. A thing I noticed the first time I saw the Bethesda photos, the corpse upper lip is jolting out slightly, just as your lip does when you put in false teeth over your real teeth. The corpse is lying on its back, so gravity should be pulling the lip closer to the teeth rather than farther away. Kennedy's mouth was nothing like this. Some people do have a lip like that, but Kennedy never did. I don't think this corpse does either. It appears that these very perfect teeth are false overlays. They aren't even dentures, since that would require pulling the real teeth. They are just expensive costume teeth like they use in Hollywood. You can tell when actors have them in, even now, that they are thinner and more advanced, since the upper lip always moves out a tiny bit to make room for them. Even the tiniest change in a mouth will be noticed by those familiar with a face. In a painted portrait, the tiniest alterations in a mouth can change the entire likeness. And that is true with real life. Costume teeth have always done this, and they still do. For visual proof, go to the Friends DVD where Ross whitens his teeth. He has false fronts over his own teeth, and this is clearly immediately. His mouth looks strange as soon as he comes on screen, and yet we may assume these false teeth were the best you could buy. Friends was not short on money in 2000, and the scriptwriters would not want you to think that Ross was wearing false teeth. It would appear that those in charge of the Kennedy autopsy chose this corpse because it had very good nose and the general features of the head were close to Kennedy's. The overall shape of the head and especially of the jaw is a close match. They tried to fix the teeth and the visible eyebrow, but the rest of the head was left as is. The teeth were made almost invisible. They are all the same and therefore evade notice. This was a good halfway solution since it would require people to go to Kennedy's photos to find small distinctions, and most people aren't going to do that. But the biggest problem is that this corpse is of a man at least a decade younger than Kennedy. Here's Kennedy smiling with those teeth. The public saw Kennedy with such stars in his eyes that most forget he was no longer 30 or 35. He was fairly young and still quite handsome, but he simply did not have skin like this. He never did, even when he was 30. But most people do not notice things like that. Look at the younger picture of him as a junior senator, when he really was in his early 30s. Even then, you can see the main forehead line and the fairly rough complexion and the folds under the eyes. By rough complexion, I do not mean that he had any blemishes. I only mean that he looks like a man who had always gotten a fair amount of sun. He does not have smooth, girlish skin, and some men do have, even men in their 40s. But the Bashida corpse does not have this kind of smooth skin. It is not Kennedy. It is not even close, really. For one final proof, look at the overhead shot. Here we look down and can see the corpse body. We know that President took pretty good care of himself, but this corpse is buff by the standards of the day. The shoulders are very muscular, the pectoral do not sag, and there is no belly at all. That does not look like any 46-year-old man, but especially not Kennedy. Even a 46-year-old man who was an ex-athlete would not have skin like that. As with the face, this is the skin of a 30-year-old, and Jack simply was not that thin and buff. He was in fairly good shape, but he was not training for the 200 backstroke in the Olympics. I return you to the large photo of him from 1963, jowls like that don't go with a flat belly. These photos would be leaked only to a very ignorant and gullible populace by people who had no regard at all for the intelligence of those they were trying to fool. Look again. Are these two photos of the same man? Another thing that most people don't know is that Kennedy wore a back brace. He had worn one for years. In addition, he had injured his groin in 1963 and was wearing a full shoulder to groin base at the time of his assassination. This has not only prevented him from bending over to protect himself from Oswald's second bullet, we are told. Of course, it would also have prevented him from exercise. There is no way his torso would have looked like this in November of 1963. Before we move on, I remind you of another very strange thing from the story. According to the mainstream account, when Jack was put into the coffin in Dallas, Jackie took off her wedding ring and put it on his hand. Ask yourself, why would she do that? She seemed to have been in a big hurry to end her part in this play, don't you think? Also strange, when Air Force One arrived in Maryland, the coffin was loaded into an ambulance instead of a hearse. Guess who was driving? The same guy that had driven the car through Dallas, Agent William Gere. We are told that both of these things were due to requests by Jackie. But why would she want an ambulance and want Gere to drive it? No, that is obviously a total cover-up story. More likely, Jack himself requested it because he was in the ambulance and they weren't going to the hospital. Jack was being driven into a private airport for his trip to Martha's Vineyard, and Gere was part of his regular Secret Service details. The ambulance would help them run lights while the hearse would be expected to move slowly. Even strangers, we are supposed to believe Jackie requested there be no undertaker or funeral directors, with that job being done by the Navy. What? Again, it is obvious they had to limit access to the body since there was no body. You don't need an undertaker when there's no body. In the same way, we find the Navy did the autopsy, which again is not the normal or the legal way to do this. Having the military take over this suspicion in the extreme, and that has always been admitted. Here's one picture published from the autopsy. Look closely. It isn't a photo, it is a drawing. Professional mortarisms were brought in from Gallers and Bashida, and we are told they are the ones who reconstructed Kennedy's head. This had to be the story since everyone knows the Navy doesn't do stuff like that. Despite that, they bring in Jackie again to explain why the coffin was closed for the funeral. She went over the heads of everyone, including Bobby and MacArthur, refusing to allow an open casket. William Walton agreed, and you will like his quote, "You mustn't keep it open. It has no resemblance to the president. It's a wax dummy." The last thing Jackie said before closing the coffin for good was, "It isn't Jack. It isn't Jack." So they are telling us straight to our face. Also interesting is that cross erected by Grawl's funeral home was removed by the Kennedys. No cross was at the funeral, despite the Kennedys being Catholic. The same Casson funeral carriage that was used in the Lincoln funeral was used for Kennedy, signaling again this was fake. And finally, the expensive first casket from Dallas that was used to get Kennedy to Bashida, and that was supposedly damaged, was suspiciously not kept as part of the assassination. Despite a bill being passed in 1965 specifically to preserve all such artifacts, it was purposely destroyed. I guess you see why. It was a forensic evidence and could be used to prove Kennedy wasn't in it using DNA techniques. Now let us leave Kennedy for a moment and look at Oswald. Oswald has been picked apart more than any man alive or dead, except maybe Shakespeare. And yet there is at least one piece of evidence that has so far been overlooked. When Oswald was taken from one cell to another, he was given a black sweater to wear. In the movie, The Men Who Killed Kennedy, the officers interviewed is used as a grist for the alternative theory. But his statement is still not fully analyzed. He tells us that Oswald had two sweaters there and was asked which one he wanted to wear. We're told that the first he wanted to wear the gray one, but then he changed his mind and wanted to wear the black one. Notice that it is desired that we believe Oswald chose the black one, and that it seems like a toss-up. It seems completely absurd. It could just as easily have been the gray one. Just a matter of Oswald tossing a coin in his head and choosing on a whim. If we think anything about this, which is unlikely, we think maybe he chose for some very human reason one that had to do with his grandmother or his baby's daughter or his old dog Fido. The apparent randomness of the choice foils us from one questioning it, but we should ask 4 questions at least. 1, are we to believe that Oswald was arrested in the theater with a bag full of different colored sweaters and that he was allowed to keep them in his cell? 2, are we to believe alternatively that his wife Marina showed up with a suitcase full of clothes and it was sent directly onto Oswald for his maximum comfort? 3, are we to assume that the officers who had starved and punched Oswald into the shape we see him in the famous footage suddenly became concerned that he might be a tad chilly and he offered him his choice of garments? 4, but most importantly, we should ask why the sweater is black. We must assume that it was not Oswald's free choice taken from his traveling wardrobe. Prisoners are not given choices like that. It was the choice of the handler, whoever they were, Dallas police or FBI or whoever, and it was chosen for a reason. Why black? If Oswald is wearing a light color when he is shot, people will see the blood and know he was shot. So what? People don't mind if he is shot. Most people are in the mood for lynching, and there should be no reason to hide the blood from the public. No. The whole point of him having shot on camera is to prove he was really shot. Those in charge of the events that day went to a great deal of trouble to be sure he was shot on camera, from moving him when he did not need to be moved, to doing it during the day, to doing it in an uncontrolled way, to calling the press and inviting them in, to clearing a path so that Oswald could walk straight toward the camera, to clearing a path so that Ruby could walk right up front with no questions asked. But what if he was wearing a light color and shots ring out and there is no blood? People might ask questions like, where was he shot? If he was shot in the head or torso, there would be visual blood immediately, and people don't die from leg wounds. Ruby would have to be an idiot to miss or hit him in the leg from 2 feet away. So obviously you want Oswald in a black sweater, not because it hides the blood, but because it hides the lack of blood. If you're going to fake a shooting, you put Oswald in a black sweater. Then all you need is the sound of gunshots and Oswald being pulled quickly to the floor. No one will comment on the lack of blood because due to the black sweater, they wouldn't have seen it even if it was there. It is the perfect cover for a fake shooting. It is almost inconceivable that Oswald could be put in a black sweater and no one could comment on it for 44 years. Is it customary to see prisoners transferred in black sweaters? Have you ever seen any other prisoner transferred in a black sweater? Never. No. It is sort of like transferring a prisoner in pumps and a floppy hat. It is simply not done. So ask yourself why the alternative theory never mentioned it. Or if they do mention, they immediately spin it as illogical way. When the whole world wants someone's blood, you don't put them in a black sweater to hide the blood. No, you put them in a black sweater to hide the lack of blood. Another thing is very strange here, and it is a dead giveaway as well. It may have been commented on before, I don't know. Watch the film closely and you will see that Oswald cries out and lurches forward even before the first shot is fired. He must have heard someone step on a bug or something. He is a good actor, in other words, but he misses his mark here by about a second. I've watched this over and over on YouTube, and he is telling truth. Whether you still can find this video, I don't know, but I know it was out there, and he does lean forward before the shot. He goes and leans forward a bit. Then we hear the first shot, and then he gives us his big Oscar-winning performance with a little bit louder oomph. Then he is pulled to the floor. Some might say that is because bullets travel faster than sound, but these people are fake psychics of some sort who have outsmarted themselves. Yes, if Ruby had been several hundred feet away when he shot, and he had shot with a .30-06, then there would be a time delay, but he was only a few feet away. There is no time delay due to sound from a few feet. Oswald was shot with a bullet, not a laser. Plus, Ruby used a snub-nosed revolver, which actually has a bullet speed less than the speed of sound on the ground. But even with a bullet speed of 4,000 FPS at a few feet, no time delay would be apparent. There is simply not enough time for a gap to evolve. Oswald could not have felt the bullet a full second before we heard the sound, or even a split second before. It takes a person some time to react even to pain. The pain response is slightly faster than tactical response and slightly slower than muscular reflex, since it does not have to go through the brain, but it still takes time. It is not instantaneous. It is on the order of 100 milliseconds. At the elevation of Dallas, the speed of sound would be about 1,200 FPS. Sound traveling 20 feet, says from gun to microphone, would take 16 milliseconds. So even if Oswald had been shot by a laser with the speed of light, he still could not have reacted before we heard the sound of the shot. The shooting of Oswald was fake. It was a movie production, as Oswald was clearly in on it. More indication of what found by other researchers after I published this paper, although I used very little of the research of others in compiling this paper. Originally, a small amount of good researchers has come out afterwards, possibly in response to my findings. But again, it totally does boil down to, seriously, you don't, okay, I just shot a president, but I get to choose what sweater I wear. I mean, common sense, people, let's go. A YouTube video posted by Amy Joyce in 2017 compares the still photos to the films, tracking the camera flashes. She finds flashes for the photos of Jack Beers and others, but none for the ironic Bob Jackson photo above. I will be told he shot without a flash, but we can see that isn't true. The shadows we see are from a flash. Since they are cast directly backwards, if he had been relying on the light above, the shadows would cast down. This means the event was run at least twice, which explains the discontinuities I find just below. Not many people have seen the second photo of Oswald's shooting, since it has mostly been suppressed in recent years in favor of the ones above. See a problem there? How about that microphone hanging down from the rafters? Don't you think it is suspicious that this scene was pre-mic'd, since it was supposed to be unpredictable and spontaneous? Don't you think it is suspicious that two separate cameras from two separate angles just happened to capture this unpredictable event? And where is this second cameraman supposed to be? Hanging from the ceiling? Either that or he is 12 feet tall. Also, this is supposed to be in a parking garage in the basement of Dallas Police Station. There is a white car right in front of these guys. What basement is lit like this? Look at the shadow cast by the people as well as the shadow cast by the hanging microphone. There are powerful lights set up in the front of these people. They are not lit from above as you would expect in such a place. They are lit strongly from in front. So there were powerful lights set up on the scene. This is an indication it was staged. I will be told this contradiction my comments about the flash above, but it doesn't. In the film, we see that in between flashes, the shadow still chased pretty much straight back, indicating this was lit by floods from the front for the movie cameras. That still wasn't enough light for the still frame cameras which flash, but a parking garage would be lit dimly from above, not brightly from the front. We already know that other Oswald photos were fake. For instance, the famous photo of Oswald with his gun from Life magazine was proved to be fake by contemporary experts. Malcolm Thompson, a 30-year-old veteran of the Forensic Science Laboratory in the British Police Force and specialist in fake photos, stated that in 1978 BBC documentary these photos were fake. In the same documentary, the head of the Canadian Air Force Photographer Department came to the same conclusion. I could tell that immediately, since his head is too big for his body. More good research was done on the gun by Macmillan at YouTube in 2013. Since I predicted that will be taken down, I will gloss it. Louis Felsen reported to the FBI that Crescent sold the Carmanon rifle to Klein Sporting Goods in 1962. His later affidavit to the Warren Commission conflicts with the paperwork and all other surviving documents. That rifle is listed still being boxed in early 1963, and then box number were scrubbed after that, making it impossible to track the rifle. In addition, the rifles Klein had for sale were 36-inch rifles, while the Carcinos we have now are 41. The microfilm the FBI took of Klein orders in 1962 and 63 had conveniently been lost, sort of like the original film of the moon landing, the dog ate it. Then there is the matter of the money order Oswald allegedly used to buy the rifle. How stupid are we supposed to think he is? He wouldn't pay cash to prevent this from being tracked. Anyway, the money order was never cashed by any bank, meaning clients probably never got paid. That's kind of curious, isn't it? If they didn't get paid, why would they deliver the rifle to Oswald? The U.S. Postal Inspector in Dallas, Harry Holmes, later testified that he found the stub of this money order, but we have to take his word for it since the stub was never physically produced. Again, the dog ate it. A National Archive employee allegedly found the money order itself in Alexandria, Virginia. I guess that's better than finding it in the men's room at Langley, but the money order should have been in Kansas City, where all Oswald's other money orders ended up, although I suspect McCrilliman is using this to lead you into some other conspiracy theory. We can't use it here, as you see. It is perfect evidence the entire event was hoaxed. I will tell you a bit more about Oswald before we move on. One of Oswald's government handlers is known. His name was George D. Morinchistel of Russian heritage. His father had been a major general in the Tsar army before Lenin took over. He was raised in Poland, but immigrated to the U.S. in 1938. Although we are told by mainstream sources that he was thought to have been a German spy, his brother Demetrius is admitted to have been OSS, and a founder of a CIA Radio Free Europe. They never bother to explain why one brother was suspected of being a German spy, while the other was hired immediately by the CIA. At any rate, the CIA soon got George involved with the oil business as a cover. As an oilman, he traveled widely, including trips to Costa Rica, Cuba, and Yugoslavia, where he was accused of being a U.S. spy. He lived in Venezuela for a time, working for Penipec Oil, which was owned by the family of the William F. Buckleys. Of course, Buckley is now known to have been CIA himself. De Montchalin was also a personal friend of Clint Mershon, H.L. Hunt, George Bush Sr., and Ted Dealey. But there's more. In March 1963, de Montchalin received a heightened government contract for $285,000 to set up an industrial enterprise with other investors, which include surveying oil and geological resources on the island. In May, he met in Washington, D.C. with CIA and Army intelligence contacts to further his heightened connections. All of this is admitted at Wikipedia, which is astonishing. Probably wiped now, but maybe not. I think by now there's at least one thing we can all agree on. They like to whitewash the information, but they do it so poorly. To whitewash the information, they first have to give it to you, and once you have it, there is no way to really cleanse it. It's obvious. de Montchalin was CIA. As such, he was assigned the job of handling Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. But back to Ted Dealey. Does that name ring a bell? Dealey Plaza in Dallas was named after Ted's father. Both were publishers of the Dallas Morning News. So it was no accident the alleged assassination took place on Dealey Plaza. This was part of the plan and the script. We have already seen that de Montchalin was very connected, to say the least. He was not just a private person helping out Oswald because Marina Oswald happened to be Russian. Since all this is known about de Montchalin, including extensive testimony he gave to the Warren Commission, it has to be spun. It is spun to this day, even by the alternative theorists. They calmly point to de Montchalin as further evidence of conspiracy. Most often they use his existence to imply that the CIA got Kennedy. But that is just another pushed reading of the facts. It is far easier and simple to conclude that de Montchalin and the CIA were controlled by Kennedy. Why? Because de Montchalin was also a close personal friend of the Kennedys and Borzan. Again, we can get that straight from Wikipedia, which admits that Jacqueline grew up calling de Montchalin Uncle George and would sit on his knee. He became a close friend of Jacqueline's aunt, Etta Boulard-Blais. How do you spin that? Well, people are still trying, including cutting-edge conspiracy theorist Lehman Sheff, who gives us much of the same information but then refuses to see what it means. He diverts us by telling us that Eisenhower warned of the CIA in 1960 when Kennedy was coming into office. He tells us Eisenhower was warning of the Ablucher who had taken over the country, but what Sheff forgot to remind you is that John Kennedy's dad, Joseph, was one of these oligarchs in the 1950s. He was one of the richest and most powerful men in the country, which the election of his son to the presidency should tell us, if nothing else. And who else was one of these oligarchs? Jacob Schleff. Schleff. Why does Lehman Schleff have no bio up on the internet? As with Peter Schliff, his history seems to have been scrubbed. You may now link to my newer paper on Ruby, where we find he was Rubinstein, whose father was from Russia. This doesn't mean that Russians were involved. It means Ruby was an agent himself. Among the interesting things we discover there, the Russian bankers Marty Rubinstein, personal banker of the Romanovs, as well as the handler of Rasputin. Rubinstein paid Rasputin's rent. Also interesting is that Ruby's attorney was a Stanley Kaufman. The Kaufmans were also tight with the Romanovs, marrying at least 2 princesses in the early 20s, Prince Romana Ishtlin and Prince Dmitry Romanov. If you choose to continue to read more stories by Milos, you're going to learn that how they're all related, and it's insane. I mean, even people today, all your Hollywood movie stars, presidents, everything, they're all related. It's crazy. But anyway, so they were marrying into the upper reaches of the British peerage at the same time, linking them to the Somerset Dukes, among others. They were also marrying the Habsburgs in Germany and Italy. They were also marrying the Mohrenschilds. That may provide a link between Ruby and Morshenscheid, which would also link Ruby to Kennedy himself. Also of interest is that Ruby currently has a clean record regarding the Oswald murder. He is legally innocent. Yeah, you read that right. Since he allegedly died while his case was under appeal, his record was wiped. Now let us return to Kennedy. Many alternative theorists have proposed that the Bessensheim corpse is not Kennedy, and they have explained the switch by saying that the murders needed to be able to match the wounds to film or theories. But the wounds of the corpse do not match the Zapruder film, and besides, it would make more sense and be much easier to match the film to the wounds than the wounds to the film. Most alternative theorists think that the Zapruder was tampered with, so why not tamper with it to make it match? Why tamper with both the corpse and the film, only to have them contradict each other? Both the film and the corpse were faked, so don't imagine I am denying it, but they weren't faked to make the wounds match. The other reason for switching the corpse is to match the Warren Commissionary theory of a single gunman and a magic bullet. But the Warren Commission is a fantasy from beginning to end, as the alternative theorists tell us. If the Commission could manufacture and sell such a lie, they could have manufactured and sold a similar lie that incorporated Oswald's magic bullet and Kennedy's real corpse. In other words, they were obviously not limited to any facts, since they ignored facts whenever they wanted to. They had no need to switch corpse. All they needed to do was sell a slightly different lie. The wounds don't match Zapruder or the theory as it is. In that case, why not have the real corpse instead of a phony? The phony corpse does not solve any problem. In fact, as part of either the standard theory or their alternative theory, the phony corpse has no logical place. A stand-in corpse doesn't sell any part of the Warren Commission findings, and it doesn't make sense in a cover-up either. In a cover-up, you switch the perpetrators, not the corpse. I can't say that word, sorry. In a cover-up, switching the corpse would cause more problems, not fewer. And that is what we see. No, the only reason you would need a body double corpse is if you don't have a real corpse. Those who argue that the corpse is not Kennedy never ask the correct questions. The correct question is not, where is Kennedy's corpse? If the Zapruder film is fake and the corpse is fake, then we have no evidence that Kennedy was killed at all. Ding, 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 there's your $1 million question. All we have is a bunch of eyewitness testimony that a guy in a car who looked like Kennedy appeared to be wounded, and a bunch of ear witness testimony of shots fired. That is not proof of anything. We have already seen the Oswald fake being hit a second too early, with no blood, because it was done on camera with the world watching. Kind of like other events, huh? We think we have billions of witnesses. Yes, we have billions of witnesses to a guy falling down after a shot is heard. We have witnesses to nothing, likewise with Kennedy. We have witnesses to absolutely nothing. It may have been the murder of a president, the murder of a body double, or a complete act. Without the president's body, the correct question is, where is the president? Where is he hiding? That is the correct question. That has been the correct question for decades, and no one has ever asked it. Mr. Morningstar does not ask it either. He presents us with a very detailed theory that provides us with a stand-in corpse, but he uses that only as a further proof of a conspiracy. He does not follow his own lead in any logical way. Yes, a stand-in corpse does sound as further proof of a conspiracy, but that conspiracy must include Kennedy himself. Since he is not accounted for, because Morningstar stops so abruptly, one tends to assume that he thinks that because Tibbet must be buried in Kennedy's tomb, Kennedy must be buried in Tibbet's tomb. What would the point of that be? Or maybe he wants us to assume that the enemies of Kennedy were so vicious they fed his remains to their dogs or ate him himself as a final revenge. That is what is strange about almost all the alternative theories. They are ludicrous, pro-Kennedy. I can understand being anti-Castro or anti-mob or anti-Johnson or anti-CIA, but that does not mean you have to think Kennedy was a saint, battling these combined forces of evil. I am about as far from the Republican or big money agenda as you can get, but I know something about Kennedy too. I know something about America politics, and I know you don't get to be president by being a white knight of any kind. Morningstar, by his own admission, worked for the Kennedy campaign in 1960, and all his theories are slanted toward Kennedy to this day. Other alternative theories are even more one-sided, and if we were to believe them, Kennedy was turning America into a paradise, only to be thwarted by closest Nazis in his own cabinet. Nazis he has appointed himself. Even Lyndon LaRouche pushes this view of Kennedy, which is highly strange. Johnson, we are told, wanted nothing more than to escalate in Vietnam, simply to get richer, and yet Jack had no inkling of this. In other words, Johnson, through Democrats, was a fastest swine, while Kennedy was a purblinded idealist, ignorant of the most obvious fact around him. I have to admit that I don't like this sort of silly and transparent propaganda any more than I like the sort of propaganda I get from mainstream sources. As further support of this, I send you to the full speech of Kennedy on that shadow government, the one I mentioned earlier. The web is now stiff with excerpts from this speech, and the excerpts are used for two main purposes: to show that Kennedy was fighting against the shadow government in the way that Teddy Roosevelt is said to have done, and number two, to show us that the shadow government has now taken over after the false flag of that certain date. But the full speech does neither one. All you have to do is listen to the full speech to realize that the excerpts are taken out of context, and that the gist of the speech is the exact opposite of what we have been told. This was so awesome when I learned this, because he is supporting these people, not warning us against them. This is awesome. Okay, anyways, JFK is in fact speaking in favor of governmental secrecy. Yeah, that's right. There is no doubt about this. No room for debate. He says it outright in plain English. He is speaking before the press, asking them to censor themselves out of patriotism. He says that war has not been declared, so certain legal provisions are not in strife effort. But he asked the press and the American people to act as if they are in a declared war, and to therefore put up with heightened levels of government and official secrecy. Not only is JFK's speech not a contradiction of someone else's about a certain thing, it is clear precursor. JFK has a better speaking voice, but he is saying the same thing. He is using the Cold War as an excuse for secrecy and unaccountability. The real meaning of the full speech kills, number one, above, since Kennedy was already a member of the shadow government, asking for more shade. But notice that it is also kills number two. The shadow government did not take over after that certain date. The shadow government always has existed. We will see to what extent below. That this speech should now be used by liberals to counter the neocon agenda is amazing. We must assume that those who use it this way, including that date, truthers and JFK alternative theorists, are either very ignorant or very dishonest, or both. I think it is possible, even probable, that disinformation is being purposely broadcast by all sides, and it is also possible, even probable, that those who hatched the Kennedy plot are in control of both sides and both theories, both for and against, both the standard model and the alternative model. But let us return to Dallas to deal with Zaprupa and the other films, as well as other things going on that day. As others have pointed out, the Z film was fishy from the get-go. I wish I could have called the Z film from the beginning. I don't think I'm saying Zapruder right, but we'll call it the Z film. The get-go, due to the missing frames. It contains lots of other anomalies discovered by hundreds of researchers. Some of these anomalies I would confirm here if I cared to, but I don't. I don't because it's the end. All these anomalies act as more misdirection. They get us focused on details when we should be looking at the overall picture. The biggest problem with the Z film and other films analyzed has so far been focus. And I don't mean the focus of the film, I mean the focus of the analyst. We have to sift the more important facts from the less important facts. We got to do this with anything when we look into anything, but I highly, highly, highly recommend, now that you know that he is not warning us against these Illuminati secret societies, that he's part of it and actually threatening almost them for, you better do as I say, kind of listen to the speech again. It's like amazing when you learn this truth. It's so amazing. You're like, oh my gosh, he wasn't saying to protect us. It was to protect himself. Very amazing stuff. There are a lot of facts available in Dallas, but only a few of them will be crucial to any final argument. We don't need piles and piles of inconclusive findings. We just need a few conclusive findings. That would be enough to start with. Facts that rely on testimony are never really facts. The other side can always dismiss testimony, calling it a lie or misremembrance. So we need facts that do not rely on anyone's testimony. If they will not accept our witnesses, we certainly don't have to accept theirs. By the same token, if we think their witnesses are lying, there is no reason for them to take ours on faith. And then there is the very real possibility that no one is telling the truth except those who know nothing. So we must begin with a clean slate. All witnesses on both sides should be thrown out as unreliable. And this is the same thing I found when I was working on that certain date in 2001. I had to throw out all the witnesses because the witnesses just take you in so many different directions and you don't know who's telling the truth. So right away, we had to go on facts only, no witnesses, all witnesses thrown out. Once we do that, we are down to an analyst of the film and photos and of other existing physical evidence. The guns and the bullets may or may not have been planted, so we must treat them like the witnesses, untrustworthy. That leaves us the film and the photos. These also can be fake. So we need evidence that transits any possible fakery. Is it possible to find evidence like this? Could it be possible to accept without argument that all the films are genuine and complete and still have perfect evidence of a plot to mislead? Is it possible? In fact, it's very easy. The world needs reminding that the burden of proof is on the side of the government here. They are the ones that are trying to sell a story. That story is that JFK was assassinated in Dallas. That story should be very easy to prove, beyond any doubt. All we need is a body. Well, I have shown that we don't have a body. They didn't want to give us that. They gave us lots of real poor photos of other people with wounds and stories that changed in spectacular fashion between Dallas and Bashida. Without that evidence, we must look to the films and photos from Dallas. We don't have to show they are fake or tampered with to show that they prove nothing. We can accept them as they are, as genuine and complete, and still show that they prove nothing. We do this by showing that they are not continuous. We will admit that some of the films and photos from earlier in the route seem to give us a positive ID on the Kennedys. We will also assume they were actually taken that day, although even this is not certain. But we have no film or photo from which is possible to ID the occupants of the car once it reaches Dealey Plaza. Z film and all other films and photos from Dealey Plaza are not of a quality to determine if we are looking at the Kennedys or doubles. We can see lots of people taking pictures in the Dealey Plaza, but they always manage to shoot from far away or behind, and Z film is the least clear of all. From Z film, it is hardly possible to identify the car in exact details, much less the occupants. This is true even before we reach the plaza. Altgen's photos on Houston Street, just before turning into the plaza, is from behind. And Scott Hale's photo from Main Street, although from the side, is inclusive. If anything, Hale's photo is evidence of a body double. Census profile looks nothing like Kennedy. When did Kennedy get a jaw that jutted out like that? Also notice the date at the top of that photo, March 64. They are testing you. It is both highly unusual and highly suggestive that we have no non-stop coverage of the entire tour of Dallas. A presidential motor car through a major city in the open air on a sunny day, a very rare event for any number of reasons, not the least of which was that it would be certain suicide for Kennedy or any other president before or after. And yet we have no moving coverage by the big three channels. We have to rely on shaky cameramen like Bell and Z Film and so on, who can't even center the picture. Why? Why is that? And why does no one else ask that question? Why do the alternative theorists always ask questions that lead off into a mire or a bog, but never ask questions that lead somewhere? Why do we have 44 years of people getting bogged down in technical details, eyewitnessing testimony, and other dead ends, while the cruel questions are never asked? The question of tampering or faking a film is interesting, but it is not crucial. The center fact of all the films is that, taken as a whole, they don't provide a continuity. The entire motorcade could have stopped just before the Daily Plaza for cold drinks and a bathroom break, and we wouldn't have no knowledge of that. You will say there would have been testimony to such a thing, but you should say there might have been testimony to such a thing if anyone had thought it was important enough to mention, and if that anyone had not been suppressed, then yes, we would know of it by testimony. Otherwise, we would not know of it. There are many things we do not know of from that day, and adding one more thing to that list is hardly revolutionary. Suppose that just before Daily Plaza, the Kennedy did run into a department store really fast, surrounded by the Secret Service, and then ran out again, only a minute later. The crowd would think it was a bathroom break and think nothing of it. After a murder, who thinks to mention something like that? How could it be pretentative? If anyone does mention it, it is shrugged off as inconsensual. No. You will say we have no evidence that it happened. And I respond, we have no evidence that it did not happen. Because of the strange video evidence that has come down to us, the possibility is wide open. That is all I need. I don't need to prove anything. All I need to show is that we have no reliable evidence that the Kennedys are in the car in Daily Plaza. Section added March 2015. A reader just pointed out to me there is congressional testimony with Conley where he admits they stopped 2 or 3 times. Mr. Specter, did the automobile stop at any point during this procession? Governor Conley. Wow, yes it did. There were 2 occasions on which the automobile stopped in Dallas, and perhaps a third. There was one little girl, I believe it was, who was carrying a sign saying, "Mr. President, will you stop and shake hands with me?" or that was the import of the sign. And he just told the driver to stop, and he did stop and shook hands, and of course he was immediately mobbed by a bunch of youngsters, and the Secret Service men from the car following us had to immediately come up and wedge themselves in between the crowd and the car to keep them back away from the automobile. And it was a very short stop. At another point along the route, a sister, a Catholic nun, was there, obviously from a Catholic school, with a bunch of little children, and he stopped and spoke to her and the children. And I think there was one other stop on the way downtown, but I don't recall the precise occasion. But I know there were 2. But I think there were still another one. Knowing what we now know, you have to admit that is curious testimony. All 3 stops are curious. The first 2 read like a Hollywood script. Insert specially for emotional effect. Children and nuns. I am just surprised we didn't have to hear about a 3-legged dog and a veteran in a wheelchair and a mom with an apple pie. But the third is the strangest. Conley can remember these children and nuns, but he can't remember that third stop. Any psychologist would tell you this reads like someone's covering something. It's textbook. It has all the signs of poor lying. Someone telling a fib and not doing it well at all. He thinks he stopped a 3rd time, but can't tell us what it was. Why even mention it then? Why not just say 2 times or make up some stupid story about the 3rd time? Because he's a bad liar. And his conscience is inserting itself right there. It's Hugh Troidman red flag. I suggest this 3rd time because he is a bad liar and is conscious is inserting itself right here. It is a huge Friedman red flag. I suggest this third time Conley is thinking of is the time they stopped to bring in the body double. Just as I had said, it is impossible to know, of course, but it proves my point. I said this could have happened, and as far as the stopping goes, it did happen. According to this curious testimony, they stopped at least 3 times. 3 times. When, if this thing had not been completely controlled, they should not have stopped at all. The government is claiming something, not me. The government has some minimal burden of proof, not me. You and I are like the jurors, not the lawyers. We should be presented with real evidence, not expected to present it. Our primary job is to falsify claims, not make them. The government claims that Kennedy was killed, and it offers us as evidence the Bathsheba photos and the films from Dallas. I only need to show that the government's evidence proves nothing. I am not calling upon to prove an alternative theory. On the contrary, the government is called upon to show proof the president was killed. It has not done that. Because of the lack of continuously in the film and the lack of positive ID in daily plazas, we have proof of nothing. The evidence only appears to point to a murder of Kennedy. But logically, it absolutely fails to do so. If you watch all the films that day, you are left with the impression that we have a complete record of the motorcade through Dallas. You think you are able to positively identify the Kennedys at the beginning. You assume continually, as so you assume the Kennedys are in the Z film. But as I have shown, we have no evidence that the Kennedys are in the car in the Z film. Lacking continually, we only have what we can see. And what we can see is people who look like the Kennedys from a distance. We know that the Kennedys traveled with lookalikes, so this is proof of absolutely nothing. Given the evidence we have, it is possible, and I would say almost sure, that Jack Kennedy is not in that car in Daley Plaza. Given this, it simply doesn't matter if the film or photos were tampered with or faked. Even in complete and perfect form, they don't prove or even indicate anything. The only thing they indicate is that someone that looks like Kennedy got hit in the head by something. Given the quality of the film and photos, it could have been a bullet or a tomato. We have no way of knowing. I think the Z film was tampered with, but even if we accept the final cut as genuine, the fatal hit still looks more like a man getting hit by a tomato from the front than it does a man getting shot from either the front or the back. As a matter of ballistics, the fatal hit doesn't look like a bullet hitting anything. Any honest fireman expert would tell you that. Entry wounds don't look like that at all, and exit wounds don't have a spray pattern like that. A real exit wound from a rifle would have sprayed forward onto Conley in a visible forward cone, not a circular little puff. All the expert testimony you have seen on TV or read is planted disinfo. But it doesn't really matter. All specifics and minute questions of facts are besides the point once you realize we have no strong or even leading evidence that anyone was killed that day. We don't have to prove it was or was not Kennedy, or that it was or was not a bullet, or that it was 1 shooter or 20 shooters. All these things are beyond proof or disproof, given the evidence we have here. The bottom line is that we have no evidence that would hold up in court that Kennedy or anyone else was killed that day. In fact, that is precisely why Oswald had to appear to be killed. The government couldn't risk taking him to trial and giving him an attorney. They not only had no evidence against him, they had no evidence that the president was dead. Any good attorney would have found the gigantic holes that I have just found, and any honest jury would have had to dismiss for lack of body. Given that, the correct answer is not where is Kennedy's body or who killed Kennedy and why. Drum roll, please. The question is, why did Kennedy fake his own death? The lack of body, the cover-up, the tampering with evidence, the incredible amount of inconsistencies, the lies told on all sides by everyone, the misdirection and misinformation, the continued misdirection and misinformation after 44 years, all point to a death that was quite simply faked. Neither the standard theory nor the alternative theories fit the facts or the evidence. Both accept the assassination without any proof or requiring any proof. Why? What kind of investigator accepts a murder with no body? What kind of alternative investigators are brave and honest enough to propose that fake corpses were used, but never a scene, that this means there is no real corpse? Why do alternative theorists rush to the initial conclusion that Kennedy was assassinated just as fast as the single bullet people? You will say they do so because Kennedy was no longer president, was no longer visible, was no longer living at his old address, was no longer found at Hyson Point or Martha's Vineyard, etc. But that is proof of nothing. I could say that is proof that the U.S. government chose to go underground on that day, November 22nd, 1963. And that is the way they choose to do it. Kennedy wanted more secrecy, and what better way to achieve that than to take the entire presidency underground? This is not to say that Kennedy had to live in Iron Mountain and never see the light of day again. It just is to say that he had to quit making public appearances, had to hide his movements, and so on. Other people have done that for decades. People without the resources of the White House and the federal government. Naysayers will argue that this is impossible. Naysayers make the same argument about that certain date in 2001, and it holds the same amount of water here as it does then. None. They say that things can't be kept secret, that people can't disappear, and so on. Complete balderdash, of course, since we have any number of examples of both. Lots of things are kept secret for decades, and people that aren't dead disappear all the time. The official reports of the assassination is proof of itself. Even if you believe the Warren Commission, you must be aware that certain secrets still exist. The final documents of the WC are not to be released in 2017, assuming that critical doctrines were not destroyed long ago. And we're not stupid. We know whatever they released in 2017 was still their garbage story. Like they would ever give us truth. Anyways, the House assassination documents in the National Archives, some 848 boxes of sealed documents, are not to be released until 2039. This is common knowledge. Those are secrets being successfully kept, are they not? Another example is the Manhattan Project, kept secrets for years. Another secret is Lookout Mountain in Laurel Canyon, kept secret for decades. Another example is the current gag order on Sybil Edmonds. That is a secret being kept today, is it not? The government has many official means of keeping secrets, from gag orders and sealed documents to reacted passages to various levels of classification. To assume that secrets can't be kept is simply to admit to naivety, which I 100% agree. I mean, again, when I was doing my book on that certain day, I think I came up with 250 people. All of them were connected, and it was crazy. They had dual citizenship, both in America and also in Israel, which hopefully this doesn't make this get taken down. But yeah, it all like bam, bam, bam. So to keep a secret, yeah. And for people to say, oh, well, people would find out. No, you pay people enough, they'll do whatever you want. Money talks. We all know this. So this ends part 1. Please continue to part 2.